Jacka Raubo, this is the Scanner Defense 24, and we have today a great honor to have here Professor Andrew Michtą. He served as the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies since 2016. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Sir, it's a great privilege and honor to have you here, and I need to underline that you will be presenting your own private opinions, and this is not the opinion of George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies and U.S. Department of Defense, as I understand.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you for having me.
Sir, we have almost 12 months after Russian invasion in February 2022. So first of all, I would like to hear your opinion, what the current situation can tell us about the transatlantic relations and how NATO works in practice due to this situation in Europe. Because after 2014-2015 situation, there was a lot of criticism over this NATO approach to the security in Europe. But how NATO react right now, and what is your opinion about the future of NATO in the context of this war in Ukraine?
Yeah, these are excellent questions. So first, I would say that NATO is politically unified like it hasn't been for years. This was also a point that was made by Vice President Harris at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago. We see eye to eye on the nature of the threat that Russia poses to Europe. Second point I would make is that this crisis made us also aware of how disarmed a lot of our European allies have become over the last 3 decades of the so-called peace dividend. And there's now a sense of urgency that this has to be undone, that we need to spend on defense, and not so much even in terms of percentages of GDP, I would argue, but in terms of real exercised military capabilities. And the third point I would make here, I mean, you have seen with President Biden's visit to Kyiv yesterday, his visit to Warsaw today, how important that relationship is both for the United States and for the European allies. We either hang together or we will hang separately, as we like to say. I think NATO is on track to restore its capabilities. I think the new planning that's being developed for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic space is going to provide the right framework for this. Overall, I think in the context of the tragedy of this war and the Ukrainian people suffering, for the alliance, it is the time of rebuilding and coming back together.
But do you think that this a very visible sign that European partners in NATO will realize that they need to restart their military capabilities from, of course, armed forces to their military industrial complex? Do you think that this is a real change, or only we are right now defined by emotions connected with this war in Europe? Do you think that we will restart, or we will try to restart?
I can speak, from the U.S. perspective, for example. So we used to produce about 15,000 155 millimeter howitzer rounds per month. We have now increased this by 500%. We're also dramatically increasing the production of the HIMARS missiles and all other systems and munitions. Other countries in Europe, especially the flank countries, I mean, Poland is an excellent example of that. Both purchasing weapon systems and munitions and also issuing new contracts and orders. I would say that the lesson we've learned from this when it comes to the defense industry is twofold. One is that we have allowed it to shrink too much, especially in Europe. But we also need to expand in the United States. But the second more important one, I would argue, is the way we approached munitions and efficiencies. The mantra, just in time, when it comes to munitions production, has to be replaced by the saying, just in case. We need to stockpile and store munitions in numbers that reflect the kind of intensity of state-on-state conflict that we're seeing. Other governments in Europe, I'm looking especially at Germany, need to feel more urgency in issuing contracts. I think the same goes for France, issuing new contracts for manufacturing of weapons and munitions. But I think we as an alliance are coming together around that, and we have to shift to essentially wartime production, looking at the rates of consumption that we see in Ukraine.
So you've mentioned also about this unification of political strategy of NATO members in Europe and in the United States, in Canada. Do you think that is a long-term chance for this unification, not only toward this year or last year, but like we had during the Cold War, that sometimes there was a lot of struggles, political struggles between allies, but we had a kind of one agenda for a long-term perspective. Do you think that right now this war in Ukraine redefine our agenda in 21st century?
That's a good point. Actually, what you had during the Cold War was a sense of a deeply shared threat perception across the European space. It was obvious to anybody that whether you were in Norway or in France or in Germany or in Spain, in the event of a Warsaw Pact attack against NATO, we were in the same boat. What happened over the last 3 decades is what I called regionalization of security optics. The countries along the flank, if you go to Riga, Helsinki, Warsaw, Bucharest, they're very keenly aware of the threat that Russia poses. Countries further west felt more insulated. Also had different strategic priorities. France historically is oriented towards the south, towards the Med. Germany had buffer states now following the unification. So this fracturing of the common threat perception was very important. I think this is changing now. I think Russia has brought about a real shock to the system. And especially, I work in Germany right now. This is my second tour. I've been here since 2016, as you've indicated. There is a real change, I think, and it's a painful change, and not just in terms of policy, but also in terms of the country's strategic culture. Remember that Germany is the area of main U.S. legacy installations, main entry point for U.S. forces to reinforce Europe. Poland is the key frontier state right now. Poland is in a position that West Germany was in during the Cold War. I think as we work the political piece going forward, I think the decisions will then align in terms of resourcing the new strategy. SHAPE is working at full speed. I was recently at Ramstein at a conference where we're discussing some of these issues on the new defense and deterrence planning when it comes to defending Europe and the transatlantic space. I'll make one additional point. I think Washington realizes that because Europe has disarmed to such an extent, it will take some time to restore the capabilities. But I think there's consensus that the US will bridge in Europe for the duration, provided that Europeans are indeed serious about spending the money and building the capabilities. Europe is a very wealthy continent. It should have more than ample resources to provide for the bulk of conventional deterrence and defense in the event, deterrence would fail. And the United States, of course, will be here with nuclear umbrella, high-end enablers, the kind of cross-domain capabilities that we provide. I think this is a moment in which the alliance either fully steps up and rebuilds itself, or we will be in trouble going forward as we have a very tense situation in the Indo-Pacific as well.
You talk about this different perspectives from Paris, Berlin, and Washington. But do you think that this concept of 360-degree NATO is the answer for that when we will be much more consolidated over the threats coming from Russia, but also coming from Indo-Pacific or also from Africa? And do you think that right now this war in Ukraine and the role of, for instance, Russia in Africa can provide us a better understanding that we are united in this transatlantic security better than before February 2022?
Yes, I think what you see is, first of all, very keen understanding on the part of the U.S. administration, and I think the Europeans as well, that the Indo-Pacific, Africa, and the European theaters, the transatlantic, are interconnected. We are in an era where the nature of communications, the extent to which, especially the Chinese, have embedded themselves in every aspect of our society, but so have the Russians, right? That this is a multi-domain confrontation. I tend to look at the current battle in Ukraine as just part of Russian overall design to fight against the West in the gray zone, both kinetic and irregular means. I think that the alliance that does not look beyond the transatlantic domain will not be as effective as it needs to be. And of course, different allies can contribute different capabilities to this fight, but we cannot think in regional terms. This is a global great power competition and conflict, and we should act with that premise in mind.
So we talk a lot about new capabilities and capacities inside NATO, but I would like to hear your opinion about the future of Russian potential due to this connection with West, connection with NATO. Do you think that Russia will be still a very existential threat for us after this war in Ukraine being ended?
As long as Russia has nuclear weapons, and as long as Russia is a revisionist near-imperial power, it will remain a threat. The Russian land forces have been very badly damaged by the Ukrainians, but keep in mind that their navy is barely touched. Their strategic and tactical air force, same thing, barely touched. The Russians leveraged the last 3 decades of access to Western technology to really improve some of their systems. I'm especially concerned about their attack submarines. Because of that access, they were able to build on the Soviet era designs and become more dangerous for us. So I see Russia, as long as it is operating in this imperial mode. Putin is in effect relitigating 1991. He is trying to undo the consequences of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. He wants to rebuild the core of the Russian Empire and then establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and possibly beyond. Now, we have little control of what happens in Russia, but what we have control over is how we respond to this aggression. I believe that Putin understands only force. It needs to be defeated. The Russian military needs to be defeated in Ukraine, and defeated in a way that this neo-imperial narrative simply loses all its strength. Russia is, by all other indices, in my view, Russia is a mid-sized Eurasian power. It is not, economically speaking, or by other indices, even close to today's great powers. But because of this nuclear dimension and this revisionist mindset, I think it will constitute a threat going forward until the forces are defeated in Ukraine and Ukrainian sovereignty is guaranteed. One last comment here. I think a successful Ukraine means that Belarus will also move in the direction of democracy. The young men and women who went into the streets when Lukashenko stole the election, and even though the police attacked them, brutalized them, that to me is a signal that after 3 decades of independent statehood, even though Belarus is a dictatorship and very closely aligned with Russia, a successful Ukraine will transform the region. And I think that will finally solve the security dilemma in Eastern Europe. There is no one country solution, as I like to say, to the security dilemma in Eastern Europe. It has to be a region-wide solution. Add to this Finland and Sweden coming into NATO, we're talking reconfiguration of the entire region.
Sir, one more thing due to this Russian case. Do you think that we are better prepared to understand whole Russian policy and this strategic culture than before the war? Or we still need to invest in our thinking about a Russian style of policy, Russian style of military activity, or we are prepared to understand them?
No, we should definitely invest more. One of the most tragic kind of mistakes, in my view, at the end of the Cold War was the de facto elimination of area studies in American universities as a pathway to tenure. We moved in the direction of model building and various equations and, rational choice and institutions. During the Cold War, we we generated a whole cohort of Soviet and East European area studies experts who spoke the language, who traveled through the region, so they could provide this inner knowledge of how these cultures operate. It's a cliche to say this, but it's true. Culture eats strategy every day. So we can try to understand our adversary, but if we don't have an inside look into how that culture operates, what the history is, what the priorities and values of those societies are, we're missing a huge piece. And unfortunately, especially if you look at the experience we've had in the Middle East, we were driven by what I call the institutionalist mindset, that organizations always trump culture, that if we build institutions, systems will become, different, will transform. The whole belief that China would somehow, through export-driven modernization, become a more responsible, as Bob Zelig liked to say it, a responsible stakeholder in the international system, in my view, was nonsense. I mean, we were having a conversation with ourselves, and now we're seeing the results of that. So I am pushing as hard as I can from my end to reinvest in Russian area studies, to stop treating Russian area studies the same way we used to during the Cold War, in a sense that we now have a myriad of new nations that are becoming consolidated. I mean, Ukraine is a glaring example of that. Putin's attack on Ukraine truly consolidated the national identity, because if you looked at the eastern regions of Ukraine or western regions of Ukraine, you saw certain differences, both in terms of the use of the language, the culture, and the values. The fact that they're now under threat as a people, they're one nation, and they're absolutely dedicated to stay in the fight until they win.
So, one more thing connected directly with the situation in Ukraine. Right now, we talk a lot about this Chinese factor in the context of future situation on the battlefields. Do you think that China is still a supporter of Russia, or maybe it's kind of a pivotal actor which is trying to get more influence on this war by, for instance, planning, sharing some military weaponry and military tools to Russian partner, or still they are only observing this situation? How you are right now defining this role of China in this conflict?
I would argue that China and Russia have been aligned. Whether you call it a formal alliance or not, I really don't care that much. They've been aligned in their opposition to the United States. The old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend applies here. China and Russia have worked in tandem to create a two-frontier crisis for the United States, one in Eastern Europe, the other in the Indo-Pacific. Russia, as I said, is a revisionist threat. Russia doesn't want to completely dismantle the order. It wants to become, again, a key power in Europe, but it enjoys the benefits. The Russian oligarchs enjoy going to the West, eating at Western restaurants, buying property, staying in hotels. China is different. We call China in our national security documents a pacing threat to the United States. China, I would argue, is existentially poised, it believes, to replace the rules-based international order we have created and sustained with one built on its own values, its own interests, and its own priorities, and also its own version of kind of mercantile capitalism. I called it in one article a free market for unfree people. Essentially a mercantile market system with radically centralized control of supply chain networks and ruled by the governing Communist Party from the top, granting people, trying to seduce basically people to this new narrative. Why is this important? During the Cold War, liberal democracy, freedom meant you lived well. I mean, people in Eastern Europe, all they had to do was look across the border and understand that if you were a democracy, you were prosperous. The Chinese are providing this, in addition to the military challenge and economic challenge to the West, they're also providing an ideological challenge. They're trying to argue that they have a better way to organize modern societies. I think they're failing. I put my money on democracies any day. Democracies that are mobilized around a common cause, in my view, are unbeatable. And I think we're moving in the direction where the collective democratic world is being mobilized to oppose both the Chinese and the Russian alliance.
Sir, and the final question, how you define the main challenges for Poland, for Polish security, and for Polish armed forces from your private perspective, and also how you define the role of this region in stabilization of European security right now, but also in long-term perspective?
So I think I'm one of those who argue that Poland is now a much more important player when it comes to NATO and European security overall. Not only is it a critical country to supplying Ukraine, without Poland, without the airfields and the rail hubs, this would not have been possible. That's number one. Number two, because the Ukrainians stood up and continued to fight, and because the Finns and the Swedes realized that being a partner gives you nothing, guarantees you nothing, that you have to have an Article 5. There's a geostrategic reconfiguration, shifting the center of gravity more to the northeast of the alliance. If you think about the assets that the Scandinavians are going to bring, the Finns are buying 62 F-35s. You add to this Norwegian air power. You add to this the strategic depth that all of a sudden the Baltic states are acquiring because those countries are coming in. You add to this an additional 830 miles of border, Finnish border, that the Russians now have to factor into their very limited land military power. The enclosure of the Baltic Sea by NATO countries. And Poland buying 250 M1A2 SEP V3, which is the most advanced version of the Abrams tank, buying F-35s, buying howitzers, artillery equipment. We're looking at Poland truly punching in a different weight class. What needs to be done, in my view? I think the Polish forces, first of all, need to work very hard to absorb all that new technology, train up, and be absolutely at the top of their game when it comes to using it. The Polish military needs to grow. The army, in my assessment, just looking at what happened, what the consumptions are, should be expanded. Now, how large the force should be, that's a Polish political conversation, and I will not be opining on that. Most importantly, once Ukraine has prevailed, remember that Ukraine today has the largest, most powerful military in all of Europe. Any reconstruction of Ukraine has to factor the cost of maintaining that robust force. I, for one, argue that a reconstruction of Ukraine, the entire conversation about EU enlargement, rebuilding Ukraine, this is only part of the conversation we need to have. We need to talk about securing Ukraine. I am a proponent of bringing Ukraine into NATO. I would argue that until and unless Ukraine is secured, there will be no investment of private equity or businesses going into a country that's threatened with destruction at any moment. So we need to have these two conversations in parallel. Yes, EU enlargement, but Ukrainian security. NATO membership or some formula under the NATO umbrella, I leave that to politicians to sort out. And one final comment, Poland that will have a secure Ukraine on its flank will find itself in a very different geostrategic position. And this offers Poland an incredible opportunity, coupled with the kind of stimulus you will see to reconstruct Ukraine, using the highly educated populations that you have in Poland, that you have in Ukraine, that you have across the region, close cooperation with the intermarium countries and with the United States. I think we're looking at really a system transforming war, as I once called it. This is an inflection point in history.
Thank you very much, sir, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It was a Scanner Defense 24, and thank you for viewing us and our discussion.